joining us this afternoon. It is really amazing to see this full house, to give Ferris Jabr the warmest possible welcome to Yale Law School and beyond. I'm Laurie Sellars. I'm the Postgraduate Fellow with the Law, Environment, and Animals program at Yale Law School, and I'll be introducing today's talk and also moderating the Q&A. Before we get into the fun stuff, I have a few logistical announcements. First, please be aware that this talk is being recorded, and I have to also say the opinions and statements expressed by event moderators and participants are their own and do not represent the views of the university. All of the food, which it looks like is gone, is vegan. And I also want to thank our many co-sponsors for this event: the Poynter Fellowship in Journalism at Yale, the Yale Animal Law Society, the Yale Environmental Law Association, the Yale Journalism Initiative, and the Yale Sustainable Food Program. So we're very lucky to have Ferris Jabr joining us today to talk about his new book, Becoming Earth: How Our Planet Came to Life. Ferris is a science writer and a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine and Scientific American. He's also published in numerous other publications, including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's, National Geographic, and the list goes on. His work has been anthologized in multiple editions of the Best American Science and Nature Writing series, and he has received support of a Whiting Foundation Creative Nonfiction Grant, as well as fellowships from both UC Berkeley and MIT. So as I mentioned, he's going to be talking about his new book, Becoming Earth, today. And I've had the great pleasure of reading this book, and I will say that if you are looking for something to give you a perhaps renewed sense of wonder and awe about the planet on which we live and the other myriad forms of life that we share this planet with, this book might be for you. It chronicles the myriad ways in which various forms of life have shaped our planet, and does so with the kind of scientific rigor that you may find in a textbook, while also imbuing it with a rich narrative that truly will make you appreciate the beauty of the world in which we live. I will say that there were many moments in this book where I had to reread sentences because I simply was so stunned by what I was learning. For example, there are microbes that live under the Earth's crust that might have been alive for millions of years, and also that kelp forests can grow, or individual pieces of kelp can grow 2 or 3 feet per day. And also a really critical component of this book is Ferris also chronicles how humans have shaped and are very intensely shaping the world as we know it today, including, for example, that there is now a new form of rock because of the ubiquity of plastic pollution in our world. So with that, I will hand it over to Ferris. Thank you very much for being here.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for that generous introduction. So I'd love to tell you a bit about my book today. My book explores a new way of looking at our planet, not simply as a planet that happens to have life on it, but rather as a planet that came to life. And the science that informs this perspective has been emerging for quite some time, but it hasn't really had its moment in the spotlight. But we're now witnessing the beginnings of a movement that I think is going to bring these kinds of insights to much greater awareness. And my introduction to this new way of thinking began many years ago when I learned an astonishing fact about our planet's largest forest, which is that the Amazon rainforest does not simply receive the rain on which it depends. The Amazon generates about half of the rain that falls on its canopy each year. And the process by which this happens is so fascinating. So the Amazon is pulling huge volumes of water from the soil and releasing what it doesn't use to the atmosphere. And in parallel, it's spewing invisible plumes of tiny biological particles, which look like this: pollen grains, fungal spores, microbes, even fragments of insect shells. And it turns out that that combination of water vapor and tiny particles is exactly what's required for cloud formation. So the Amazon, scientists have described it as a giant cloud factory that is dramatically accelerating the water cycle above its canopy. But this massive flying river of water and biology discharged by the Amazon doesn't remain in place. It actually travels throughout the continent, bringing precipitation to other parts of South America. And through long-range atmospheric ripple effects, the Amazon is even influencing weather as far away as Canada. So a tree growing in Brazil can change the weather in Manitoba. So learning to see the Amazon that way was a revelatory experience for me because I'd always been taught that life is subject to its environment, not the other way around. And indeed, that is the perspective that Western science has emphasized. Even some of our greatest scientific luminaries have espoused this view. Rachel Carson wrote that the influence of life on the planet has been relatively slight, for example, and much later, E.O. Wilson wrote something similar. But learning that the Amazon conjured rain and changed weather around the globe made me question that conventional wisdom. And I started to wonder how else life dramatically alters its environment, not just locally in the sense of a beaver making a dam, but on the scale of an entire continent or an ocean or even the entire planet. So I was asking myself, how has life shaped Earth as a whole? And answering that question eventually took me across the globe. I traveled to a remote experimental nature park in Siberia, where Russian scientists are reintroducing large grazing animals to re-engineer the landscape and create some version of the ancient grasslands that existed there tens of thousands of years ago during the Pleistocene. I descended close to a mile beneath the surface of the planet in a former gold mine, where biologists hunt for bizarre rock-breathing microbes that transfigure and inhabit the planet's deep crust. And I eventually climbed this tower in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, which is actually the tallest structure in all of South America and functions as a scientific observatory that is literally positioned halfway between the trees and clouds. And what I learned is that contrary to those long-standing maxims, life has been a major geophysical force throughout the planet's history. Microbes, plants, fungi, and animals have radically transformed the atmosphere, continents, and oceans, turning what was once just a lump of orbiting rock into our cosmic oasis. If we traveled more than 4 billion years into the past, we would barely recognize Earth. Ancient Earth had a hazy orange atmosphere with essentially no oxygen and a vast ocean dotted with volcanic islands, but lacking substantial land masses. And life was integral to the transformations that made the planet we know today. For example, 2.5 billion years ago or so, photosynthetic ocean microbes called cyanobacteria began to oxygenate the atmosphere, a permanent shift that was later reinforced by land plants. And in doing so, they dyed the sky blue, formed the ozone layer, and made fire possible for the first time. And then there are microorganisms that are involved in numerous geological processes. They're carving vast caverns, they're concentrating precious metals, and they're responsible for much of Earth's mineral diversity. And some scientists think they even played a crucial role in the formation of the continents. Marine plankton emit gases that increase cloud cover and accumulate in layers of deep sea sediments that can buffer ocean acidification. Animals as diverse as elephants, prairie dogs, and termites are continually reconstructing the planet's land surfaces, improving the circulation of air, water, and nutrients. And all manner of life forms collectively converted the once barren crust into the fertile soils that we have today. So life is really responsible for many of the fundamental features of the planet that we take for granted or kind of assume are always the default state. Now, life does more, however, than just modify the planet's structure and chemistry. Life is also wrapped up with the planet's capacity to regulate itself. And this is one of the main examples. It's known as the planetary thermostat, or the carbonate-silicate cycle. And I'll get into the details a bit later, but the gist here is that together, Earth and life, geology and biology, have co-evolved ways to bring Earth's climate back to a stable state when it moves into an extreme one, like an extreme hothouse state or a deep freeze. And the mechanisms underlying this stabilizing feedback loop involve both geology and biology acting in concert. So studying these kinds of intimate connections between life and Earth, between geology and biology, brought me to one of the most provocative ideas in the history of Western science. And those of us who came of age in the 70s or 80s may remember the Gaia hypothesis. It was conceived by James Lovelock in the 1970s and later developed with American biologist Lynn Margulis. And it proposed that wherever life emerges, it inevitably transforms its home planet, and that together, life and the greater planetary environment form a single self-regulating living system. And when Lovelock published his first book on these ideas, they were widely popular with the general public, but harshly criticized by the scientific community, especially by Richard Dawkins and his allies. And that was partly because, by Lovelock's own admissions, he did make some big mistakes in his original articulations of these ideas. He initially gave the impression that all organisms were deliberately cooperating for the explicit purpose of keeping the Earth habitable. And that contradicted, that kind of teleology, that goal-directedness contradicted mainstream evolutionary biology. But over time, Lovelock and Margulis refined their ideas, and they clarified that what they were describing did not require any teleology, because they were talking about inevitable physical interactions between life and the planet. They were describing an emergent phenomenon, and Gaia was their name for that. It's now universally accepted within science without controversy that life has been a major geophysical force for at least 3.5 billion years, that together life and Earth continually co-evolve, each changing the other, and that life and the planet form a single, tightly coupled, highly interconnected system. And many scientists further acknowledge that life is integral to the planet's self-stabilizing, self-regulating processes. And these types of ideas have become the pillars of a relatively new mainstream field called Earth system science. As Earth system scientist Tim Lenton has said, the old way of thinking was that the changes the planet undergoes is a separate but parallel process to the evolution of life. And that's pretty much out the window at this point. They now see it as a single, integrated, co-evolutionary process. Earth and life are evolving together as one. And that, to me, seemed like a rather substantial update to the modern understanding of the relationship between Earth and life and to modern evolutionary theory, but one that had not yet seeped into public consciousness. And that's a big part of why I wanted to write this book. I also discovered in my interviews that many scientists, ranging from atmospheric chemists to paleontologists and geologists to astrobiologists, either now embrace the concept of a living planet or are increasingly open to it. For example, some told me that for them to say Earth is alive is now a plain statement of fact, and others have written explicitly about Earth being a living planet, not just a planet with life on it. And even some of the original strongest critics of Gaia have changed their minds over the years. The evolutionary biologist W.4 Doolittle was particularly vociferous in his criticism, but he's publicly written recently that he has changed his mind, he has warmed to Gaia, and he's now engaged in a project he calls Darwinizing Gaia, trying to reconcile the Gaia hypothesis with modern Darwinian theory. Claiming boldly that Earth is alive remains provocative. And many people who oppose this idea make the same types of objections. They say Earth cannot be alive because it does not eat or reproduce or evolve through natural selection like real living things. But the problem with that argument is that there's never been a consensus definition nor an objective measure of life. Today, textbooks continue to offer us long lists of qualities that presumably distinguish the animate from the inanimate, but the two cannot really be categorically separated. There are so many examples of things that are inanimate, but have fundamental features of the living, and vice versa. Like fire, which consumes fuel as it grows larger. Or crystals, which faithfully replicate their highly organized structures as they expand, yet are not typically considered to be alive. So life, I think, is really more of a spectrum than a category. It's more of a verb than a noun. It's not a discrete class of matter nor a property of matter, but a process. It's a performance. It's something matter does. And although science hasn't quite settled on a precise definition, I've looked at many of the proposed definitions in the past century, and I condensed them into the following. Life is a system that actively sustains itself. Living systems do something to keep themselves alive. Thermodynamics tells us that the universe is moving inescapably towards a state of maximum entropy, which means that eventually everything must dissolve into a homogeneous mush. But living systems temporarily evade that fate by using available energy to reduce their internal entropy and maintain what would otherwise be an improbable degree of organization. And theoretically, any system of matter with sufficient complexity and an adequate supply of energy can participate in that phenomenon that we call life. So I think we have to recognize that life happens at multiple scales. It happens at the scale of the cell, the organism, the ecosystem, and even the planet. I've come to see life not as something that simply resides on or inhabits the planet, but rather as a literal physical extension of the planet. And I'd like to make an analogy to a vast beach from which spontaneously emerge all manner of intricate sand sculptures. Just because these structures have attained a new level of complexity and organization doesn't mean they're suddenly divorced from the beach. They're still made of the same grains of sand that surround them. They are still literally the beach. And I think it's exactly the same with Earth and life. Life emerged from and is made of Earth. So what we call life is really Earth, animated. And because life is so ubiquitous, it endows Earth with a planetary scale anatomy and physiology, dramatically increasing by hundreds of thousands of times the surface area of the planet that is capable of performing complex chemical reactions, absorbing and transforming energy and exchanging gases. And I've come to see all the life on the planet as Earth's living tissues, and all the activities of those organisms as the planet's metabolism and physiology. And indeed, some scientists now speak of it this way as well. So tying this all together, if we accept that life is a literal physical extension of the planet, that together Earth and life form a single tightly coupled system, and that greater planetary system demonstrates many of the fundamental features of life, anatomy, physiology, evolution, and perhaps most importantly, self-regulation and astonishing resilience, having endured for more than 4 billion years, then we must recognize Earth itself as the largest known living entity. And that doesn't mean that Earth is a single living thing in exactly the same way as a bird or bacterium, nor that it's a superorganism like an ant colony, but rather that our planet is the largest known living system. It's the confluence of all other ecosystems with structures, rhythms, and self-regulating processes that resemble those of its smaller constituent life forms. So life may not be identical in every manifestation, but it rhymes, it echoes at every scale. So Earth may not be a single giant organism as has been previously claimed, but it is alive in a meaningful sense. It's a vast, interconnected living system suspended in the vacuum of space, eating starlight, pulsing, breathing, blooming, and continually defying the forces that would otherwise undo it. And that's exactly what we mean when we talk about life. So one of the major criticisms of Lovelock's first book on Gaia was that it was a bit thin. He wasn't really offering reams of evidence to support his bold proposals. But so much new science has happened in the nearly 50 years since he published that book, and we now have a much deeper understanding of the Earth system. So I wanted to briefly talk through some of the main examples of how Earth and life co-evolve and how the planet is able to regulate itself. So returning to this planetary thermostat, this really hinges on the element carbon, a very special element, a very gregarious element that loves to form bonds with others. It's the element on which all life is based, and indeed huge portions of the planet are made of carbon as well. And carbon is stored in various reservoirs scattered throughout the planet, and it's continually cycling between them. And where it's stored and in what proportions has an immense influence on global climate. So when there's a lot of carbon stored in the atmosphere, that is when the planet can enter an extreme hothouse state. And when there's a lot of carbon sequestered in the deep sea and crust, that's when the planet can freeze. But there's a stabilizing feedback loop built into this cycle that allows the planet to gradually pull itself back to more stable climates over tens of thousands to millions of years. And there are both geological and biological mechanisms underlying this. So when the planet heats up, the mechanisms that sequester carbon accelerate, and they start to remove more carbon from the atmosphere than is emitted to it. And that pulls carbon down and gradually cools the planet. When the planet freezes, those same geological and biological mechanisms slow down significantly. So carbon builds up in the atmosphere again, and the planet gradually warms. And this is really just one example of the many ways in which life is entangled with the planet's capacity to maintain a dynamic balance. Another profound example is how life essentially created and maintains our modern atmosphere. So again, going back to ancient Earth, there was essentially zero free oxygen in the atmosphere, and today we have 21% oxygen. And photosynthetic life is largely responsible for that transformation. But the exact amount of oxygen in the atmosphere has fluctuated wildly throughout Earth history. If we go back 300 million years, it was more like 30 to 35% oxygen compared to today's 21. And back then we had massive dragonflies the size of pigeons and millipedes as large as surfboards, and they were enjoying this oxygen-rich environment that made it easier for them to breathe and fly. That high oxygen also fueled intense megafires unlike anything we've ever seen. But around 200 million years ago, and even more so in the past 50 million years, something seems to have shifted. And the level of atmospheric oxygen is now more stable than it's been in Earth's deep past. And in trying to explain that equilibrium, Earth system scientists are converging on a possible answer, which is the braided evolution, the co-evolution of life, fire, and oxygen. And the basic idea is that the way that terrestrial vegetation co-evolves with fire acts as a regulator on the level of oxygen. So when oxygen gets really high and fuels those megafires, that burns down immense tracts of vegetation. And that weakens the very mechanism by which oxygen accumulates in the atmosphere. So oxygen levels dip back down again. And that is a form of negative feedback or stabilizing feedback. And we see this again and again in the Earth system. And similar things happen in the oceans. If you sample deep ocean water all over the world, you will find exactly the same ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus in the water as we find in the cells of plankton themselves. And it turns out that that's because plankton are creating and maintaining that chemical ratio. Plankton have evolved these incredibly complex ecological recycling systems by which they take nitrogen and phosphorus into their bodies, make them more biologically useful, and put out new forms into the seawater. And in doing so, they define the chemistry of the modern oceans. And there's an analogous process that happens with terrestrial microbes on land. And indeed, all complex life is dependent on the chemical wizardry of these microorganisms. I also wanted to mention, since the animal program is sponsoring this, a recent concept in ecology called zoogeochemistry. So the old way of thinking is that nutrient cycles are largely powered by geology and meteorology. But the new way of thinking is that we have to put animals back at the heart of these cycles because they are some of the most dynamic elements in the Earth system, and they are very powerful engines of these nutrient cycles. For example, all of the creatures like whales, jellyfish, fish moving through the ocean move seawater as much as the moon and tides. They are moving water up and down through the water column. They are moving carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and other vital elements around. And then you have migrating animals like seabirds and fish that bring those nutrients to land. And then maybe some bears and otters will eat those fish and leave their carcasses on the riverbank so that they nourish the forests. And the plants in the forest help break down the rocks, liberating their minerals, which are flushed back to the ocean by rivers. So you have these incredibly complex ecological loops that are moving nutrients around the planet's many different layers, and animals as very dynamic elements are really at the very heart of them. So how does our species fit into this new paradigm? Well, we are the latest in a long chapter of life continually transforming the planet. So in that respect, we're not unique. But we do stand out in the combined speed and scale with which we have changed the planet. No species before us has changed so many different parts of the planet in such a short span of time. We have polluted and overfished the oceans. We've commandeered more than half of the planet's habitable land to grow crops and raise livestock. And we've pumped an immense volume of carbon into the atmosphere. And in fact, some scientists think that this much carbon has never entered the atmosphere this quickly in the entirety of Earth's 4.5 billion year history, which would make us both biologically and geologically unique. And one way to think about these types of changes is through the concept of planetary boundaries. These are ecological ceilings on the amount of disruption the Earth system can tolerate before it becomes dangerously unstable and can no longer support the ecosystems on which we depend or our way of life. And scientists have identified 9 such ceilings, such as ocean acidification, the breakdown of the ozone layer, and we've already crossed 6 of them. I also think that Earth system science clarifies for us exactly what it is we've been doing to the planet. Because we're used, for example, to thinking of fossil fuels as kind of convenient resources that we can use. But that really obfuscates what they are. Fossil fuels are ancient life. They are reservoirs of ancient life that have been cooked and compressed deep within the planet. For example, coal is mostly made of ancient bog and swamp plants, and petroleum is mostly ancient marine life. And in fact, a single gallon of gasoline is equivalent to 100 tons of ancient life, or approximately 20 adult elephants. So just think about how much ancient life we are pumping into our gas-powered vehicles just to keep them running, or into all the gas-powered heating units on the planet, or into all of the power stations that still burn fossil fuels to generate electricity, which is the majority of them. And you start to get a sense of the scale of just how much ancient life we have unearthed, set on fire, and then allowed those emissions to go into the atmosphere. And that is ancient life that would otherwise have remained sequestered as part of the long-term carbon cycle for millions of years. And in fact, our species now emits 60 to 120 times more carbon than all of the planet's volcanoes combined. So we are truly a geological force. And of course, all of these emissions are thickening the planet's blanket of heat-trapping greenhouse gases. And that is rapidly raising average global temperature with all of the consequences that we are witnessing more and more year by year. But there's a new paradigm of thinking of Earth as a living planet shows us that we've done more than just harm and pollute the environment or raise global average temperature. What we've really done is to push the largest known living system into a state of severe imbalance, into a new crisis state. And some scientists conceptualize this through the landscape of risk. They visualize Earth as a kind of marble that's rolling across this landscape of risk. And sometimes it reaches peaks where it has immense potential for rapid change. And sometimes it sinks into valleys where it gets stuck for a long time. And we are currently pushing Earth towards a new deep valley, a new crisis state, a new hothouse Earth. Technically, it could pull itself back out again, but it would require an immense amount of time and energy to do so, tens of thousands to millions of years. And that in the process, it would become a world unlike anything our species has endured or witnessed, incredibly tempestuous, unpredictable, unstable, inhospitable to us. And that is why it is so important that we not only intervene, but do so as rapidly as possible. And I think Earth system science lays bare for us also the necessary response to this crisis. If we understand the long-term carbon cycle as kind of the beating heart, the ecological pulse of our living planet, we have to ask, where are the major sources of human-caused greenhouse gases coming from? Well, there are many contributors, but the two huge buckets are industrial agriculture and more generally food systems, and fossil fuels and more generally current energy infrastructure. So if we do not reform those systems, we are not going to halt global warming, and there's really no way around that. It's not really up for debate, it's just a physical fact. But we're not restricted to only reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We can also learn how to emulate and amplify the planet's innate ability to absorb, store, and sequester carbon. And really the best way to do this is to protect and restore the very ecosystems that are already so exquisitely adapted to doing exactly that. So on land, this would be forests and grasslands and wetlands. And of course, there's analogs in the oceans as well, like kelp forests and seagrass meadows and coral reefs. Now, I know that the daunting scale of this challenge and the necessary response can be very overwhelming, but massive systemic change is inseparable from smaller individual shifts. The two very much depend on each other, and it is possible to make a difference on a local individual level as well. And one of the chapters in my book focuses on the history and future of Earth's soils as an incredibly important resource. And it centers on the narrative of my partner and I turning what was a derelict turfgrass lawn into a thriving carbon-storing wildlife garden in Portland, Oregon. So it's a story of how we turned this into this. This is an aerial view from exactly the same angle, so you can see just how much it changed in the past 4 years. This is what we started with. So we bought a house in Portland, Oregon 4 years ago. It had an unusually deep, south-facing sunny lot. We were excited about that because we wanted to create a garden from scratch. So we ripped out all the grass And we quickly discovered that our soil was in really bad shape. Not only was it clay heavy, as much of Portland's soil is, but it was full of rubble and debris, and it was incredibly unworkable and unyielding. And I discovered through research and talking to neighbors that our property had previously been a construction site and a parking lot for quite a long time. And somebody had come in and rolled this turf grass carpet over all of that to mask all the abuse and neglect that had happened to the soil. And I also confirmed through laboratory tests that our soil was very depleted of nitrogen in particular, which is so crucial for plant growth. So I had to very rapidly learn a whole lot more about soil science, because previously I'd only ever gardened in a small raised bed or container, and I would just buy a couple bags of good quality soil from the local nursery. And now I had this much larger landscape to cultivate and work with. And what I discovered is that I'd really been thinking about soil incorrectly my whole life, because I'd always thought of it as a kind of earthly fabric that can be conditioned, or a repository of nutrients that you can deplete and replenish over and over again. But there's growing recognition, even in mainstream scientific circles, that soil is not just a medium or a substrate for life, but is alive itself. It's a dynamic living network of rock, water, air, and creature, much like the larger Earth system. And it's really the relationships between those elements that create and maintain soil as we understand it. And some mainstream scientists are now very comfortable talking about soil as alive. And soil is really a very recent development in the evolution of our living planet. For most of its history, it did not have soil as we understand it. It had something more like crumbled rock that you might find on Mars. The soils we have today are the result of billions of years of weathering by the elements, and then hundreds of millions of years of interaction with complex life. And it is really microbes, plants, fungi, and animals that enrich that crumbled rock with the organic compounds that make the fertile soils on which we depend to grow crops and feed ourselves. And I came to the conclusion that if you want to restore a soil ecosystem, you've got to start with plants, especially in a gardening context. So we brought a wide variety of healthy but small plants from our previous home and local nurseries. And when you do this, when you introduce them to an emaciated landscape, they immediately begin many very important processes. They permeate the soil with their roots, opening channels for water, air, and nutrients. They attract their symbiotic partners, the microbes and fungi with which they coevolve, and which form the foundation of any soil ecosystem. And they eventually cover the soil with a protective cloak of vegetation that prevents soil's unique architecture from being destroyed by the elements, as happened in the Dust Bowl, for example. So even within a few seasons, not even a full year, these plants began to rapidly expand and really fill out. This was, not even a full year later, and it's looking completely different already. We put in a pond because that's especially good for wildlife as a water resource. And this was the peak of summer bloom about 2 years later after we started this transformation. And every garden needs a guardian. This is our dog Jack enjoying some radishes and flowers. But speaking of animals, one of the greatest joys has been seeing the wildlife that this garden has brought in. Because when we moved in, all I ever saw were spiders crawling through crispy turf grass. There really wasn't any reason for animals and other wildlife to visit. And we now have this vast array of wildlife coming all the time. Not just insects, but also birds, ranging from songbirds to hummingbirds to birds of prey, mammals like a mischievous family of raccoons that visits the pond frequently, and even jumping mice that have nested in the compost bin. And I've become particularly fond of the native bees, because in addition to honeybees and bumblebees, there are thousands of native bee species on our continent, including iridescent emerald sweat bees, leaf cutter bees that slice pieces of plants and bring them back to their nest for padding, and squash bees that specialize in fertilizing the blossoms of pumpkins and other gourds and squashes. And this gardening experience has really taught me the power of symbiosis, reciprocity, and coevolution within the Earth system. Because the garden is not really ours alone. It is something that we have co-evolved, not only with all the other species around us, but also with the inanimate elements like the sun, the rain, and the soil. And I wanted to end with a quote from one of my favorite writers, Virginia Woolf, whose writing I return to frequently for inspiration. And I was stunned to rediscover this quote from her autobiographical writings because it was so resonant with what I've been learning for this book. She described what she called moments of being, where she could suddenly perceive a deeper truth or reality. And in one of these moments, she was looking at some flowers, and she suddenly realized that there was this ring connecting the flower to the earth, and that the real flower was, as she put it, part flower and part earth, and that it had been that way all along, but she was just realizing it for the first time. And I really think that is the gist of what I'm trying to convey. There is this ring that makes us materially, physically continuous with the planet, along with all other life. It's hidden to us most of the time, but we can bring it into glowing focus. And that's what I've been trying to do with this book. Thank you.